We're going to spoil the shit out of this. I hope no one minds, and I
don't mind.
I really recommend you don't see it. So, to get back to that question of why are we using clips of Alex Jones? Well, as I was sitting there and we were watching it on Sunday, I said, it almost looks like a movie that was conceived to provoke conspiracy theorists. And it seems to hit on all of these things that a lot of conspiracy theorists are really concerned about.
So it is pure conditioning for snatch and grab. It is pure operant conditioning and preparation to get the public ready for unbelievable evil. And you're told you will serve the megastate. You will serve the greater collective of the Supreme UN Soviet, or you will die. Quoting the book World War Z. The Rebs, on the other hand, armed, organized political secessionists. They were easily our most tangible danger. He would say in private, these must be eliminated swiftly, decisively, and by any means necessary. These were the enemies of our country, the domestic ones. A floating UN command center off the coast of Hawaii, consisting of 72 delegates, controls the fate of the world. Nation states are the problem. The UN's got the answers.
So that lines up a little bit with what you were saying, though, right?
Yeah.
That through most of the book, that was there was that kind of self-determination, which is kind of a. It doesn't make sense to use that term for a nation, but it's often used for nations. That nations should be able to have self-determined. This was a big Woodrow Wilson thing.
Right.
Ostensibly, it didn't turn out to be, but. Yeah. Okay. So that lines up more with where the book ultimately goes, where we exhaust, and that's the beauty. That's the if what he's saying is right, that's the beauty of the propaganda. It's like all other options have been exhausted in this situation. This is what has to be done.
Right.
But again, I just really want to stress. I know I'm repeating myself. That is all built on top of the paradigm in which we currently find ourselves.
Well, fair enough. I can see it. I mean, it's an extreme exaggeration. Like, hey, you can't handle these externalities without the help of the state.
Yeah.
And in this case, the externality is zombies.
Right.
And okay, that's a very good point. I mean, you have to have a large scale organized response to something like that.
It seems to hit on all of these things that a lot of conspiracy theorists are really concerned about. Guns. Brad Pitt is quickly armed in the film, right? He has a rifle very early on, and we're gonna go through the plot, but I just want to hit these themes that I found to be somewhat interesting. There's a scene where he's going with a doctor to South Korea, right? And he gives him a firearm, like a handgun, and while he's walking off the airplane, he trips and falls and shoots himself and dies. That's I think a strong anti-God message that you can trip and kill yourself. So that's the first one. The second one is there's a very strong theme of world government running throughout this. The UN is very, very central. That's where he's taken when he's evacuated from the city. That's the people who wants him. That's where he used to work. It's never clear what he did for the UN. The World Health Organization factors very heavily into this. Vaccines. Injecting people with things that are potentially hazardous to their health, but for a greater good. Camps. That was one of the things where I get to a point and I'd be like, yeah, I see why people would need to be in camps, which is not something that I usually think of myself saying. Like, it's hard for me to, I could see a place where people need to be put into like some kind of FEMA camp. I can see that happening. But I mean, that's the thing too. Like it's one big giant lifeboat situation.
Yeah.
Which, if you want to propagandize people towards an acceptance of these things, the lifeboat situations are what you have to create. And often when we're talking about our ideas with other people, what they try to find and grasp onto and drag into the argument is a far-fetched lifeboat situation that they feel like they can have some relief from having to acknowledge the validity of these ideas, like the non-aggression principle or even property rights, if they can come up with some kind of lifeboat scenario that just gives us pause just for a second. You know, 3-second pause without having an answer, a thoughtful answer ready to go, and they win.
Gotcha.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well,
so
I mean, zombies,
lifeboat situations are very useful.
A worldwide zombie outbreak is really a hell of a lifeboat situation, because you are literally, if you are not part of the solution, you are part of the problem.
Right.
Because if you get killed by zombies, or if you die for any reason, you become a zombie. So you either get, come to the FEMA camp where we'll keep you safe, or become part of the problem.
Yeah.
And even the people who haven't become zombies yet are described as being part of the problem, because they're taking pot shots at the guys who are trying to clean up the zombie mess.
It's the ultimate lifeboat genre, I think. So that was guns, that was vaccines, that was world government, that was camps. The fifth one was Israel. This is an interesting one. And
oh boy.
At this point, when the guy shoots himself by falling, that was when I first was like alerted to like, okay, let's pay attention. This might not just be a fun zombie movie. One of the at one point after they leave South Korea, they talk to this former CIA guy who is I don't know if he was like a saboteur or he was involved in some kind of espionage, but they're holding him prisoner, right? And he says, you have to go to Israel. They knew about it before it happened. And my ears perked up a little bit from my old 9/11 conspiracy days, because this was a central piece of the Zionist 9/11 thing. And now I'm not saying that, oh man, it all ties together. What I'm saying is this seems like it was intended to be provocative to people who are in this mindset. So Israel has prior knowledge of the zombie outbreak. Now, you guys might know this. People in the audience, you might be unfamiliar with this. One of the central pieces in the Zionist were behind 9/11 conspiracy centers around this Israeli company called Zim that was actually a subsidiary of the Israeli government. They had offices on 2 floors of the World Trade Center in the North Tower, about like considerable amount of space. They vacate a week prior to 9/11, forfeiting about $50,000 because they had the lease until the end of the year.
Right.
Suddenly without explanation. Half owned by the Israeli government. So this was, for many people, a central piece of evidence that the Israeli government, or, like somebody works for Zim who knows somebody in the Mossad, something like that. Israel, but what it translates to is Israel had prior knowledge of 9/11. I felt like if you know that, when you hear Israel has prior knowledge of the zombie outbreak, that immediately snapped to the front of my mind.
Yeah.
When I heard that. So it was almost like it was intended to be provocative. So guns, Israel, vaccines, people trying to get over a wall in Israel, that's part of it too. The world government role, and the camps. So, what did you think of the movie itself, Osborne?
In general, there's very little coherent plot involved. It didn't really have an ending.
Yeah.
I feel like the 3D did nothing whatsoever.
Right. Yeah, the 3D was not very. It didn't really add very much to it, except you get to look at other people's greasy fingerprints in front of the movie.
Yes.
It was almost like the process of sitting there and watching all this happen for 2 hours was a delivery system for the themes that we've already described. That's how I felt. I felt like the movie had a blah kind of plot. It did have some. It was like somebody kind of edited together a bunch of action sequences into a somewhat coherent story.
Point of interest: the movie was not filmed in 3D.
Ah,
it was fake 3D.
Yeah. Well, the 3D added nothing to it, and it just kind of ends. And I felt like the savior, if there was a savior or something on the way to being a savior, it was the friggin' World Health Organization. And Brad Pitt preparing these injections that it's going to give everybody.
Yeah. No, I will say the World Health Organization wasn't able to figure this thing out. It was this lone wolf Brad Pitt guy who strolls in there.
What we get is that he's like a very, very smart guy, obviously, if the UN wants him to come back and help them deal with the crisis.
That was the other thing about the movie, is everything was like filmed in such a way that it's just like hitting you over the head with a hammer. this smart man is watching something to figure it out. Check out what he's doing right now. Like at the beginning when he's doing the count for the zombie turning.
And that brings us back to one of the most important aspects of the film. Very good point. The zombies, Corey, in the movie turn in, it's either
12 seconds.
It's either 12 seconds, right? So think about the urgency that adds to everything.
Right.
Right. So there is no time. If we want to go back to the conspiracy angle or what the movie is trying to push or push you into accepting, right, with all the things that I listed, there is no friggin' time, right?
Right.
They change in 12 seconds. And didn't you feel in the movie, Osborne, that it was the situations were created and time was of the essence in such a way that it was like, oh, yeah, okay, I understand why this is happening. And I was kind of racking my brain while we were watching it, like, what would be the alternative here? But it also happens in this world, right, where all of these mechanisms for problem solving are already, moving along at full speed.
Yeah.
So when a crisis happens, where are people going to look?
Right.
And crisis is a great time for the centralization of power. So it's an important insight that you make, but I think that's what he's saying is like the really good propaganda makes people like us believe that this would be the only way forward. Right. That's the challenge here that I think we face, trying to bring voluntarist or individualist ideas to the table in an analysis of this, is that it starts with this world, right?
Yeah.
And it only escalates what's already going on in this world.
Right.
So that's a real challenge, and it makes a very, very effective propaganda. Now, I can't speak to the book, but the movie, and it does sound like we are speaking to the book a little bit.
Sure.
But
very select portions of the book. For the most part, during a zombie invasion, yes, sure, there is an individualist way of responding to a zombie invasion. And then there's another way, where you don't get eaten by zombies.
Well,
I mean, they do show examples of various people trying to figure out a solution or a way to survive on their own, some successful, some disastrously unsuccessful.
I think that the idea of trying to survive on your own sounds equally unappealing. And when we talk about individualism, I mean, the only place that individualism really exists is like in thought, in choice, in action, but it's not a way of living. And I think that this archetype that we're talking about that appears in a lot of dystopian and disaster and horror movies, right? This weird person who is by themselves in a terrible situation, and our reaction to it as the viewer or the reader is, geez, that guy's a creep. I would never be in that situation by myself. So we're not talking about like one on zombies kind of situation here,
right?
But we're the polar opposite of that is the complete surrender of all autonomy to the most distant power that you can get without actually going to like a Star Wars like galactic empire. Like the UN is the most distant governance for people on Earth. Like the closest is the individual self-governance. The furthest is the UN or some other kind of centralized global control. You'd have to go into space to get government further away from yourself than the UN. So the idea that it's pushing for that, and maybe to some extent, especially in the movie, or these movies generally, kind of make us very skeptical about the possibility of being an autonomous individual. That's an interesting dynamic.
It's funny because, as I think about it, like most of the time when people try to do like rational critiques of the underlying themes of zombie movies, especially like the George Romero zombie movies, especially Day of the Dead, they tend to focus more on zombies as being like avatars of mindless collectivism or mindless consumerism and mindless like groupthink, because all the zombies are identical to each other. They all want the same thing. They all go about it in the same way. And this is like really the opposite of that.
Skip, up the road, up the Johnny.